All right, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here. Excited.
For people watching, so Adnan is all things pricing, like strategy, price setting, packaging. And today's conversation, we thought we would cover a lot, as much as we can, about price setting, setting up the sales team. We'll just cover all the ground that we have time for.
Do it. Let's dive in.
All right. So maybe our starting point is when you're working with a company, especially with these large organizations, there's so many things to keep into consideration. So where do you start with a pricing project?
So that first phase is us diving in, very much learning from what is in place, us getting up to speed on the market, us getting an understanding of who the customer is, start to essentially develop hypotheses so we can better align price to value. So that's really the starting point of any engagement that we are on. Hypothesis development and learning is the way I have to phrase it. So before we fully align to value, what we would do is, talk to customers and really start to validate some of these hypotheses.
Okay.
And then that next phase is where we start to dive into like specific price recommendations, and then, say this is the actual price point you should land at. Ultimately, these are, say, the volume breaks. This is our recommended price metric. Point being that we take that combination of hypothesis development based on like data analysis, internal interviews, and then substantiate it with these customer interviews, et cetera, and then start to make actual recommendations on what that broad pricing strategy should be for any type of a business, right? And then the question that we often get is like, okay, we've got this awesome pricing strategy, now what, right? So where do we take it from here?
Mm-hmm. Maybe we talk about the customer interviews a little bit, because I would imagine you run into some surprises there, or probably the customer wouldn't run into surprises more so. So can you tell me a little bit about how that process works and what are some of the things that you find in those conversations?
Yeah, and that's always one of my favorite parts of the engagement, because there's just so many new learnings. What I often tell people is these direct conversations with your customers where it's open-ended and you're simply trying to explore, it's worth their weight in gold. Always recommend it for anybody that wants to better understand their value and therefore price. But essentially what we want to do is drill down to why it is that a customer is making the purchase. And you can understand it at a high level, and you can always go a little bit deeper. Categorically, the way we state why a customer wants to buy is it does one of three things. It increases their revenue, it reduces their costs, or minimizes risks. How that happens can vary highly depending on the business, and that's why we really have to understand, well, if you're buying this to make your teams more efficient, how does it make them more efficient? And how much more efficient does it make them? In what way does it impact costs? Is that a recurring impact? Is that a one-time impact? And then those types of questions and that path will start to inform you on what that value is and therefore price. We want to understand why customers are buying from our clients and how much that's worth. What is the financial value, the quantifiable financial value associated with the purchase? And then the other thing that comes out that is often helpful is, okay, these are potential gaps or areas of improvement that you could do to improve your customer experience and therefore increase the value over time. But in essence, once we have the ability to quantify that financial value, we can say, for example, as a result of our customers making a purchase, we think that they're reducing the total risk that they are incurring by an estimated, let's just say $100,000 per year. And as a result of that, now you know that you cannot charge your clients more than $100,000 on an annual basis, because that's the total value they're getting. So it's somewhere between 0 and 100,000, and that pricing strategy and pricing structure, those are those large guardrails that you have. So that ultimately the goal is to understand that quantified financial value, so you can start to make price recommendations.
When people have pricing that's misaligned, I would imagine that's a major factor. What other things do you bump into when you need to make adjustments?
Yeah. So one of the common scenarios is, as a result of the work that we're doing, the perception is that, okay, you've understood the value and there's going to be a price increase. And that does happen, but the inverse also happens where there is not a price increase and we're aligning to value, because what ultimately happens if you are priced too high, that's going to cause a lot of friction within your organization. It's going to be really hard for sales teams to go out and sell this. And what could happen, and what we've seen actually happen, is there is just discounting that's all over the place. Pricing committees are involved, sales teams are unhappy, pricing teams are unhappy. Nobody truly knows what the price is. So we've seen scenarios where, as a result of actually lowering the list price, we've seen better price realization, because sales teams are like, okay, I can go out and sell it for this price, and I don't have to go through this arduous process of saying, you know what, my customer, it's really, really difficult for my customer to buy. I have to go through this process of discounting. So we've seen increased profitability and increased sales as a result of making a recommendation where prices are lowered. So that does happen, but then the inverse also happens where, we've seen that there is some significant misalignment to value, where customers are underpriced and they have an opportunity to raise prices. But then the question is like, when there's an existing customer and they know your prices, how do you manage that from a change perspective, because your customer has this existing reference price in place? So there can be some challenges in rolling that out, particularly to existing customers, which are largely comprised of the base.
So if we stick with that, like with that example, where I guess you would start with working with the sales team, right? So how do you approach working with pricing and sales together to make that kind of adjustment?
One of the things that we encounter when we talk to people in pricing functions is, within their organizations, they're often seen as the folks are simply going to output a number.
Yeah.
Sales teams, account managers teams will say, okay, this is the general scope. This is the scope of what we want to sell. How much do I have to sell this for? And then the pricing team will take that and say, based on the input that you've given me and based on the needs of the customer, we're going to give you a price of X. Sales team's like, okay, great. I've got my price, I've got my targets, and I've got some discount authority. I'm going to go sell. The gap is, well, how did the pricing team arrive at that? What is the justification for that price? So point there being that the sales team has to know how to message that out in the market, and the basis of that has to be aligned with what the pricing team is using to arrive at that price. Having that transparency, having that fairness, and having that consistency across the organization makes teams work incredibly effectively, and that's a bit of a gap that we often encounter.
Look, at pricing, just in my experience, it can be extremely complicated. It's like an art and a science. And I think what I've seen work the best is when it can get simplified to the extreme. But I guess that's a big part of the dilemma, right? Is how do you make it simple enough for people to be able to not just understand when you're explaining it, but then synthesize it so that when they're on the phone or whatever, it's like really easy to explain.
That's exactly right. And that's where, getting back to the point we were talking about earlier with the customer interviews, that's where that becomes so incredibly important, because out of any engagement, what you've done as a result of those customer interviews is you've gone deep and understood why it is that somebody is buying. And the way that we calculate that is, in essence, what we do is put together what we call a value equation. In essence, this would be a simplified, we often like to use the analogy of like something as simple that you can write on the back of a napkin to explain what that financial value is. And then that it should be used as, one, a basis for the price, but then two, incorporated within a sales conversation. Because the challenge, and getting back to some of my corporate experience, what I've often seen is ROI calculators that companies have invested a lot in, started to vet some of these assumptions that go into it. But the challenge is that, when you've got 5 minutes with somebody, are you able to effectively articulate what the value of a solution is? With an ROI calculator, more than likely not, because it's complex. And then the second aspect that comes into play is the more complexity there is, the more opportunity there is to go in and challenge some of the inputs and assumptions that go into that model. So, that consistency, again, where you have spent the time to figure out what the value is, you've used that as a basis for price, and then you've taken it one step further to simplify that as for messaging that sales teams can use to go out there and justify price in their sales conversations is incredibly powerful.
I'm thinking about pricing and sales just in their most classic kind of personas with how they work together and how to set teams up to really learn how to communicate well. Because I think that the intersection of these two teams is where a lot of things fall apart, or one stops listening to the other. I feel like every time I'm at a pricing conference, everybody's talking about trying to get a seat at the table. The salespeople are just trying to execute and make things happen so that they can hit their numbers and get their incentives hit. So like, how do you simplify this whole thing?
Yeah. I mean, the starting point that I always say, is, particularly to folks in pricing, is when you're making these recommendations, put yourself in the salesperson's shoes. Start to get past this idea of simply focusing on numbers. The more that you can think through how to position price from a salesperson perspective and get super specific on, for an existing customer that is going to encounter a price increase of, 10, 15, 20%, what is your salesperson going to, if you were in your salesperson's shoes, what would you say to that customer? And how can you best equip your salesperson for that conversation that aligns with your goals? And then I think that same logic applies to a salesperson. When the salesperson is thinking through the price, they understand what that value is and position in a way that is fair on both ends. So, it's getting both sides, both teams, a little bit outside of their comfort zone. That goes a very long way. And then there's that obvious piece about making sure that organizational incentives are effectively aligned. We often see companies wanting to make sure that they get the right volume. They're very afraid of losing volume. And what that often does is leads to underpricing solutions or excessive discounting. So that doesn't have to be the case, but it does require a bit of change management on both sides.
I would imagine the bigger the company is, the more complicated these things get. You have more people, more processes, more baggage of what people think things should be like. And I guess that's probably where people need a lot of help. But how do you approach these big changes from a process perspective?
Yeah, the change for a big company can absolutely be bigger depending on where they are from a maturity perspective. So, I mean, we have seen organizations that are quite mature from a pricing perspective, and they've really started to get their arms around it. And it does start with operating at the intersection of pricing and sales. But to your point, right, for a large organization that is going down this path, it can be complex. So the way that I like to, conceptually start is to say, think big, but start small, meaning that to pick a specific product line or a specific customer segment and attack that first. Figure out what your value is in a very small portion, and put processes in place so that you can realize price that is aligned with value. Once you get some of those quick wins under your belt and show improvement internally, and say, we've moved customer 1 via our new pricing strategy. Now customer 2, 3, 4, 5 comes. So once you prove that out for a specific segment, then other segments are going to see it and they're going to want to latch onto that. So you very much see this snowball effect that starts with these quick wins and ends up being this impetus behind larger change management programs. The challenge is that we don't want anybody to bite off more they can chew. When you go in and say, I'm going to change the pricing strategy for 100 different products across 10 different customer segments that have a difference in value, those tend to end up being really complex. Managing that change from a pricing perspective, from a sales perspective, from a product perspective, just from an organizational perspective, a governance perspective, it just ends up being more than most organizations can handle at the same time.
Yeah. Simplicity is key.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you talk a little bit about monetization plans?
Yeah,
What does
absolutely.
that mean? How do companies create them? How does it fit into pricing?
Yeah. And again, this kind of in some ways gets back to the customer interview comment. And this is why it's so powerful, because the pricing strategy, the current pricing strategy is based on the value today. And the value can change over time. It's dynamic. The way it can change is we've seen certain customers that, they might be going through, let's call it a digital transformation, but they're at the very starting point of that digital transformation. So perhaps their software platform is something that's a bit of a pain point for customers. And when there's a pain point that comes into play, we call that negative differential value. That's something that customers want, but is a pain point for them. And that negative value has to be reflected in the price. Inversely, and product teams are aware of that, they're making investments to change that. So your price should reflect that. Inversely, there could be brand new features, brand new functionality added to a product, and that can increase the total value of the offering itself. Point being that anytime there is an investment being made, there should be an understanding on what the end value to the customer is, and therefore there should be a pricing initiative associated with that. So that's that's another gap that we often see within organizations, because product can say we're going to add features X, Y, and Z, and it's going to be great. Our customers are going to love us. But then the question is, how are you going to monetize that? And that's where,
how much is this worth?
Yeah, exactly. How much is this worth? How much? Why are we doing this? Why are we making this investment? So that's where we see better connection points between pricing, product, and sales being required to go down that path.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would imagine that's a place, those intersections are places where there's just a lot of risk involved in terms of how people are working together, how the processes are set up to support the teams. And it's just, yeah, I could imagine it gets really complicated.
For sure. In any change within an organization, there is operational and execution risk associated with that. What we like to say and start out by saying, what I started this conversation out is by aligning price to value, you're going to be in a better spot. But at the same time, I fully acknowledge that getting people to do things differently is no easy task. But building those connection points is, in my experience, the most effective way to mitigate the risks associated with change like this.
I was thinking about just examples of where you've seen clients be able to make a big change, and maybe the one that you had started to reference earlier about the price decrease would be a good one to walk through. What was the change? How did it make sales more effective? Can you just walk through what happened in that project?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a solution that better enabled companies to onboard their employees. And it took off amidst COVID because it addressed the ability to onboard in a remote environment. So it was more efficient and offered companies some cost savings, because there was obviously some operational challenges. So there's a lot of value associated with it. And therefore, the price reflected that value. What happened was post-COVID, when there weren't as many constraints in place and such, there was a bit of a change in value, but it was still really valuable, because there's still a lot of remote workers out there. So anything you can do to minimize that friction works really well. So we went in, we started to understand the rationale for the pricing, talked to a number of different customers, got a pulse on some of the specific tasks that had to be done there, because it wasn't as though, it was 100%, I'm sitting in my house, no longer have to go anywhere to get onboarded. There was still some travel and things like that involved. So we started to quantify that, the level of effort it would take, some of the risks involved with that. And then we had also spoken to folks internally to understand what the processes were. What it boiled down to was sales teams went out there and they said, this thing is actually quite valuable, but the price point we were positioning it at, customers aren't really latching onto. And then, we did some of our value analysis, did the quantification, and realized that, yeah, this is actually priced higher than it should be. But then we looked at, okay, this is the list price. What is the actual price that they're realizing? And that delta was really, really big, meaning that there was discounting of 30, 40, so up to 50% in some cases. So, the price that you're actually bringing home is way less than list price, which tells you, okay, list price is likely off, or the value just isn't being communicated effectively. So ultimately what we said is you can take down list price by, I think it was about 18%. And as a result of taking the list price down, you're no longer going to have to go to this governance committee and justify some of the rationale behind this. Your sales team is going to get that much more time to just simply talk to customers, sell more. Customers aren't going to walk away from you at the outset. And the price that you're actually going to bring home, that realized price, is going to increase as a result of you decreasing list price. So better off all around, because incremental profitability, sales teams are happier because they don't have to go through this approval process. Customers are happier because they're getting a price aligned with fair value. They don't have to go through this arduous negotiation process. And really, they're getting something that helps them be more efficient over time.
The pricing team's not seeing all of their hard work down the drain with all the list price changing and all that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, because the pricing team, the last thing they want to do is like sit there and debate the discounting, because if that's happening very frequently, then there's likely something wrong.
That's kind of interesting. I hadn't thought about that in this context, is the amount of time spent just in pure resource efficiency for how many conversations need to happen to try to make a change or try to explain things or try to get on the same page about different stuff, which I would imagine leads to, from a sales perspective, a lot of just kind of like going around.
People figure things out. People know who to talk to get their pricing approved. And I always say the best, if you were to come up with, let's just say, the ideal pricing strategy, it is one, aligned with customer value, but then two, doesn't require any internal approvals or anything like that, right? You've built it out in such a way that, yeah, it's sellable at that price, but is also reflective of the value that we have. In reality, there's obviously going to be situations where there are exceptions, but you want to think something through in a way that minimizes the exceptions that are happening.
Yeah. From a strategy perspective, being able to set that kind of thing up would also include probably built-in flexibility, right? For things like give gets, tiered offerings, so that the sales team has kind of all the input that they need to be able to make game time decisions versus having to go back, which is, I would imagine, another place where a lot of time can get spent in the negotiations, right?
100%. Yeah. You want to be able to go out there and have a starting point to say, okay, you know what, this is a price point with a feature set that reflects, let's just say, about 80% of our customers' needs. But at the same time, there's situations where we understand you guys are budget constrained or simply want a solution that's more of a base level offering. And in that type of a scenario, you have to equip your sales teams with the ability to take away value in exchange for a price concession. So we often refer to that as a flanking product. And then I think the inverse is also true, where there's a subset of customers that want the absolute best in class. And in order for them to get that, they're willing to pay a little bit more. And that's where you can create your best level offering in the scenario where there's good, better, best, but something with incremental functionality that is a little bit better. And we found that works quite well for the reason where customers want the best in class, or there's an existing base of customers, and over time you can grow with your customers. You provided an attractive path to upsell and further monetize that base, but that does require some upfront work to have a common understanding of what that variance in packages are, so you have that standardization across the organization. Because the last thing you want is for the packaging and feature to be custom in every scenario, because what that ultimately does is it's really hard to make apples to apples comparison. Nobody really knows what the price should be, and that's where you see a lot of misalignment from a price to value perspective.
And those things, I was just thinking about the other client that we were talking about, just more in the SaaS space, whereas like when you're getting started and you're growing very quickly, those kind of things and putting them in place is a big task, but also can help scale. So maybe that's another thing we get into in the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. The level of maturity of the company, where they are in the market life cycle, if something is just being built from the ground up versus something that is mature, is absolutely going to impact your pricing strategy, pricing and negotiation strategy. It touches so many different parts of the organization, from sales to finance to marketing to product, because ultimately what you're after is to optimize price realization and sales, so customers can be on the path to profitability and again get a price that is aligned with the value they're giving to their customers.
Tale as old as time.
Exactly. The way you do it differs, but the concept is the same.
Yeah. Well, this is great. Thank you. I appreciate you doing this. And I feel like we've got a couple different things we could pick up on next time, but we've got a lot to think about.
Great conversation. Always a pleasure.
All right. Thank you.